The music thumped against the walls of the Anchor Club, a popular off-base gathering spot where Navy personnel unwound after long deployments and training exercises. The San Diego establishment had seen its share of celebrations, arguments, and the kind of military bravado that comes with youth, adrenaline, and too many drinks. On this particular Friday evening in March 2019, the crowd was typical, mostly male, mostly loud, and mostly convinced of their own importance in the grand scheme of naval operations. Captain Sarachan sat alone at a small table near the back wall, nursing a club soda and checking her phone occasionally. At 42, she had learned the value of observation, of listening before speaking, of understanding a room before making her presence known. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy blue blouse, and comfortable flats. Nothing about her appearance suggested military service, let alone command authority. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with quiet confidence rather than the aggressive posture many associated with military leadership. The table next to her hosted 4 junior officers from the USS Nimitz, their conversation growing louder with each round of beer. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a cocky fighter pilot with barely 3 years of service, was regaling his companions with tales of his latest training mission. His voice carried the particular brand of arrogance that comes from flying million-dollar aircraft and believing that makes you invincible. These desk jockeys back at command have no clue what real naval warfare looks like, Morrison declared, gesturing broadly with his beer bottle. Half of them have never seen combat, never felt the G-forces, never had to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. They sit in their climate-controlled offices making policies about things they've never experienced. His companions nodded agreement, each adding their own complaints about command structure, regulations they deemed unnecessary, and superiors they considered out of touch. Lieutenant Commander Rick Torres, a submarine officer, leaned forward conspiratorially. "The worst part is they're putting people in charge who got there through politics instead of merit," Torres said. "I heard they're even talking about putting more women in command positions on combat vessels. Can you imagine? When things get real, when lives are on the line, you need someone who's been tested, someone who understands what it means to fight." Sarah continued to sip her drink, her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times throughout her 20-year career. Early on, such comments would have sparked anger, frustration, a desire to prove herself through confrontation. Experience had taught her that the most effective responses often came through demonstration rather than argument. The conversation at the neighboring table grew more animated. Morrison had moved on to criticizing specific naval policies, displaying a profound misunderstanding of strategic decision-making that made Sarah wince internally. He spoke about fleet movements as if they were simple tactical maneuvers, ignoring the complex logistics, international relations, and long-term strategic implications that informed every major naval operation. "Take the situation in the South China Sea," Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the increasingly crowded bar. "We should just sail through there with a full battle group, show them who owns those waters. But, instead, command sends us on these careful diplomatic missions, walking on eggshells around countries that should respect our superior firepower." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and saw a reminder about her early morning briefing with the Pacific Fleet Admiral. Tomorrow's discussion would cover the very situation Morrison was oversimplifying, a delicate balance of power projection and diplomatic restraint that required understanding far beyond what most junior officers possessed. Lieutenant Torres noticed Sarah sitting alone and nudged Morrison. "Hey, check out the woman at the next table. She's been sitting there for an hour. Think she's waiting for someone, or just trying to meet a military guy?" Morrison turned to look, his alcohol-enhanced confidence making him bold. "Probably another local looking to land a naval officer. They think we're all rich and romantic because of the movies." He raised his voice slightly, clearly intending for Sarah to overhear. "Maybe she's heard about the generous military benefits and wants to lock down a provider." Sarah felt the familiar weight of assumption settling around her like an unwelcome blanket. Throughout her career, she had encountered men who saw her gender before her rank, her appearance before her accomplishments. She had learned to navigate these moments with strategic patience, understanding that premature revelation often served her purposes better than immediate confrontation. The bar continued to fill with evening patrons. Groups of sailors clustered around tables, their conversations mixing sea stories with complaints about duty schedules. Near the front entrance, a table of Marine officers engaged in heated debate about training protocols. The atmosphere grew thicker with testosterone and alcohol, creating the perfect environment for the kind of mistakes that would haunt careers. Morrison's group had attracted attention from nearby tables. Their loud criticisms of command decisions and dismissive comments about military leadership began drawing nods and additional commentary from other junior officers. What started as private griping was evolving into an impromptu forum for airing grievances against the naval hierarchy. "The problem is they promote people for the wrong reasons," declared Lieutenant Amy Foster, a supply officer who had joined the conversation. "It's all about checking diversity boxes now instead of actual qualifications. They care more about how something looks in a press release than whether it makes operational sense." Sarah watched the dynamics unfold with professional interest. She recognized several psychological patterns common in military social settings: the need for peer validation, the tendency to blame higher authority for personal frustrations, and the dangerous confidence that comes from partial information. These officers were intelligent and capable in their specific roles, but their understanding of organizational complexity remained limited. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Admiral Patricia Hayes, her immediate superior, asking about her location. Sarah responded that she was observing local morale conditions and would have interesting insights to share during their morning meeting. The Admiral's response was immediate: "Learn anything useful about junior officer attitudes?" The question made Sarah smile slightly. Admiral Hayes had suggested this informal reconnaissance, understanding that genuine leadership insights rarely came through official channels. Young officers spoke differently when they believed no senior leadership was present, and their unfiltered opinions often revealed important organizational issues that formal surveys missed. Morrison had begun pontificating about naval aviation, displaying technical knowledge mixed with concerning gaps in understanding. He spoke confidently about aircraft capabilities while demonstrating poor comprehension of carrier operations as integrated systems. His critique of flight deck procedures revealed someone who understood his individual role but failed to grasp how that role fit within larger operational requirements. "These safety protocols they've implemented are ridiculous," Morrison complained. "We spend more time on briefings and safety checks than actual flying. In real combat, you don't have time for all this bureaucratic nonsense. You need pilots who can think fast and act decisively without waiting for permission from some risk-averse desk officer." Sarah recognized the dangerous thinking behind such comments. She had seen young officers injured or killed because they confused recklessness with courage, because they failed to understand that safety protocols were written in blood, literally derived from analyzing previous accidents and fatalities. Morrison's attitude suggested someone who might cut corners under pressure, potentially endangering himself and his shipmates. The group's conversation had attracted a small audience. Other tables now listened openly to their criticisms of naval leadership, creating a feedback loop that encouraged increasingly bold statements. Sarah observed how group dynamics amplified individual prejudices, how the desire for peer acceptance could lead intelligent people to express opinions they might reconsider in private reflection. Torres leaned back in his chair, his confidence boosted by alcohol and audience attention. "The real problem is they're trying to make the Navy politically correct instead of combat effective. We're warriors, not social workers. When you're facing an enemy submarine or incoming missiles, nobody cares about sensitivity training or diversity initiatives. They care about competence and courage." The comment drew enthusiastic agreement from several nearby officers. Sarah noted how Torres positioned political awareness and combat effectiveness as mutually exclusive, revealing a common misunderstanding among junior personnel. In her experience, the most effective military leaders understood that diverse teams often performed better under pressure, that inclusive leadership created stronger unit cohesion, and that social awareness enhanced rather than hindered operational effectiveness. Morrison stood up, emboldened by the growing audience. "You know what we need? Leaders who've actually been in the fight, who understand what it means to put their lives on the line. Not people who got promoted because they knew the right people or said the right things in the right meetings." Sarah finished her club soda and considered her options. She could continue observing, gathering more intelligence about junior officer attitudes for tomorrow's briefing with Admiral Hayes. She could leave quietly, avoiding the confrontation that would inevitably follow if her identity became known. Or she could engage directly, turning this moment into a teaching opportunity. Her decision was made when Morrison's comments crossed from professional criticism into personal attack. He had begun speculating about specific senior officers, making assumptions about their qualifications based solely on demographic characteristics. His words revealed not just professional disagreement but fundamental disrespect for the chain of command and the principles of military service. Sarah checked the time on her phone. 2200 hours, still early by military social standards, but late enough that alcohol had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. The perfect moment for truth to emerge, for assumptions to be challenged, for young officers to learn lessons they would remember for the rest of their careers. She stood up slowly, her movement casual but purposeful. Several officers at nearby tables noticed her rising, their conversations pausing as they wondered if the civilian woman was finally leaving or perhaps approaching their group. Sarah walked toward Morrison's table with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command authority, though her civilian clothes still concealed her military identity. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly as she approached. Conversations continued, but attention focused increasingly on the interaction about to unfold. Morrison and his companions looked up expectantly, assuming she was either leaving and wanted to say goodbye, or approaching to join their conversation as an interested civilian. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, her voice carrying clearly without being raised. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about naval leadership. You've made some interesting points about command qualifications and combat readiness." Morrison grinned, interpreting her comment as validation of his opinions. "Yeah, it's pretty obvious that the Navy has some serious leadership problems. Are you interested in military service, or just curious about how things really work?" Sarah smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I have some familiarity with how things work. I was particularly interested in your comments about putting people in command positions who haven't been tested in real situations." The group exchanged glances, pleased to have attracted the attention of an attractive woman who seemed to appreciate their insights. Torres gestured to an empty chair. "You should join us. We could give you the real story about what's happening in the Navy these days, not the sanitized version they put in the newspapers." Sarah remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert. Around them, other conversations had quieted as patrons sensed something significant developing. The attention wasn't obvious. Military personnel were trained observers, but the social dynamics of the room had shifted toward anticipation. "I'd be very interested to hear more," Sarah said. "Especially your thoughts on what qualifications make someone ready for fleet command. You mentioned combat experience and understanding real warfare. What other characteristics do you think are essential for senior naval leadership?" Morrison leaned forward eagerly, seeing an opportunity to impress both his peers and this interested civilian. "Well, first you need someone who's been in actual combat situations, not just training exercises. Someone who knows what it feels like when people are shooting back. Second, you need technical expertise, real understanding of weapons systems, tactics, ship operations. And third, you need natural leadership ability, the kind that makes people want to follow you into dangerous situations." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Those sound like important qualifications. Have you had opportunities to serve under officers who possessed all those characteristics?" The question caught Morrison slightly off guard. He had been expecting agreement, not inquiry into his personal experience. "Well, some of my commanding officers have been solid. Others." He trailed off, unwilling to criticize specific superiors by name in front of a civilian. "I'm curious about your own experience," Sarah continued. "How many combat deployments have you completed? What weapon systems have you operated in actual warfare situations?" The questions were polite but pointed, and Morrison began to sense that this conversation was not developing as he had anticipated. "I've completed 2 deployments to the Persian Gulf region. I've flown training missions that simulated combat conditions very realistically." Sarah's expression remained neutral. "Training missions. And, have you ever been in a situation where enemy forces were actively trying to kill you? Were your decisions directly affected the survival of your shipmates? Morrison's confidence wavered. Look, training in today's military is incredibly realistic. The simulators we use are exactly like real combat situations. Just because you haven't been shot, it doesn't mean you don't understand warfare. Interesting perspective, Sarah replied. So you believe simulation provides adequate preparation for the psychological pressures of actual combat? That someone who has never faced real enemy fire can make the same quality decisions as someone who has? Torres jumped in to support his friend. Training is training. The principles are the same whether it's an exercise or real combat. Good officers can adapt to any situation. Sarah turned her attention to Torres. And, your combat experience? How many times have you taken a submarine into hostile waters where enemy forces were actively hunting you? Torres shifted uncomfortably. Submarine operations are classified. I can't discuss specific missions with civilians. Of course, Sarah said smoothly. But, speaking hypothetically, do you think someone who has never commanded a vessel in actual combat conditions would be qualified to lead a submarine squadron? Or make strategic decisions affecting multiple boats and their crews? The questions were exposing the gap between the officers' confident criticism and their limited experience. Other patrons had begun paying closer attention, sensing tension developing in what had started as casual conversation. Morrison tried to regain control of the discussion. Look, I don't know who you are or why you're asking these questions, but our opinions are based on military training and experience. We're not just talking out of our asses here. Sarah's smile remained polite, but something had changed in her demeanor, a subtle shift toward authority that made several nearby officers unconsciously straighten their postures. I'm sure your training has been excellent. The Naval Academy and Officer Candidate School do outstanding work preparing junior officers. I was simply curious about your perspective on the relationship between experience and qualification for command. Morrison frowned. How do you know about Naval Academy training? Are you military family or something? Something like that, Sarah replied. I've had some exposure to military education and training systems. Enough to appreciate the complexity of preparing officers for leadership responsibilities. The evasive answer frustrated Morrison, whose alcohol consumption was making him less diplomatic. Well, whoever you are, you can't argue with the basic principle that command should go to the most qualified people, regardless of politics or social agendas. Sarah nodded. Absolutely. Merit should always be the primary consideration. Though I imagine defining merit can be challenging. Would you say merit is determined primarily by combat experience? Technical expertise? Leadership effectiveness? Strategic thinking ability? Torres answered quickly. All of those things matter, but combat experience has to be the foundation. You can't lead warriors if you've never been in a fight yourself. Fascinating perspective, Sarah said. So you would argue that officers without combat experience, regardless of their other qualifications, should not be considered for senior command positions? Exactly, Morrison said emphatically. Combat is the ultimate test. Everything else is just theory until you've been in actual life or death situations. Sarah glanced around the room, noting that their conversation had attracted a considerable audience. Officers from multiple tables were now listening openly, some nodding agreement with Morrison's statements, others looking uncomfortable with the direction of the discussion. I appreciate your honest opinions, Sarah said. It's always valuable to understand how junior officers view leadership and qualification. Though I have to say, your perspective raises some interesting questions about military history and command structure. Morrison sensed challenge in her tone. What kind of questions? Sarah's voice remained calm and conversational, but her words carried new weight. Well, using your criteria, many of history's most successful naval commanders would have been disqualified from their most important roles. Admiral Nimitz had never commanded a ship in combat when he was appointed to lead the Pacific Fleet in World War II. His qualifications were based on strategic thinking, organizational ability, and leadership potential rather than personal combat experience. The comment caught Morrison off guard. His knowledge of military history was less comprehensive than his confident opinions suggested. That was a different time, different circumstances. True, Sarah agreed. Today's Navy is far more complex than Nimitz faced. Modern naval operations integrate cyber warfare, space-based systems, advanced electronics, international law, diplomatic coordination, and logistics chains that span the globe. Combat experience, while valuable, represents only one component of the knowledge base required for senior command. Torres tried to redirect the conversation. Look, we're not saying combat experience is the only qualification. But it has to be a major factor. People who've never been tested under fire might make decisions that get people killed. Sarah's expression grew serious. That's a valid concern. Though I'd argue that poor decision-making can result from many factors: inadequate training, insufficient information, flawed judgment, ego, fear. Combat experience doesn't automatically prevent any of those problems. Morrison was becoming frustrated with Sarah's ability to counter their arguments. You seem to know a lot about military leadership for a civilian. What's your background? Are you some kind of military analyst or defense contractor? The question hung in the air as Sarah considered how to respond. She had gathered valuable intelligence about junior officer attitudes, confirmed some concerning trends in military culture, and identified specific individuals whose thinking might benefit from mentoring. The moment had arrived to decide whether this encounter would remain an observation exercise or become a teaching opportunity. Sarah looked directly at Morrison, her casual demeanor shifting slightly towards something more formal. I do have some familiarity with military leadership challenges. Enough to recognize that the issues you've raised tonight are important ones that deserve serious consideration. The non-answer increased Morrison's frustration. That's not really an answer. If you're going to criticize our opinions, at least tell us what gives you the authority to do so. Sarah glanced at her watch. You're right. If we're going to continue this discussion, proper introductions are appropriate. She paused, letting tension build in the room. Though I should warn you that my background might change the dynamic of our conversation. The warning created palpable anticipation among the listening officers. Some sensed that the evening was about to take an unexpected turn, while others remained focused on the surface-level debate about military qualifications and leadership. Morrison crossed his arms defensively. Let's hear it then. What makes you an expert on naval command? Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a simple leather wallet. The movement was casual, but several officers noticed the deliberate way she opened it and removed what appeared to be an identification card. She held it at chest level, facing Morrison and his companions, allowing them to read the military identification that revealed her true identity. The effect was immediate and devastating. Morrison's confident expression crumbled as his eyes processed the information on the military ID. Captain Sarah Chen, United States Navy. The rank insignia showed 4 gold stripes, indicating a senior officer with significant authority and responsibility. But more shocking than her rank was the assignment designation visible on the card: Commander, Destroyer Squadron 15, Pacific Fleet. Torres went pale, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his lips. He recognized the squadron designation and understood its implications. Destroyer 15 was one of the Navy's premier destroyer squadrons, responsible for coordinating anti-submarine warfare, air defense, and surface combat operations across the Pacific theater. Command of such a squadron required approval from the highest levels of naval leadership and represented a position of enormous strategic responsibility. The silence spread outward from their table like ripples in still water. Officers at nearby tables caught glimpses of Sarah's identification and began whispering urgent explanations to their companions. Within moments, the revelation had spread throughout the bar, transforming the social atmosphere from casual to intensely professional. Morrison stared at the ID, his mind struggling to reconcile the civilian-dressed woman he had dismissed as a local trying to meet military men with the senior naval officer now standing before him. His mouth opened and closed silently as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. Captain Chen, Torres managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He started to stand, following military protocol for addressing a senior officer, but Sarah gestured for him to remain seated. "Please, continue sitting," Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational despite the dramatic shift in power dynamics. "I'm here informally tonight, observing rather than commanding. Though I have to say, your discussion has been quite educational." Morrison found his voice, though it carried none of its earlier confidence. "Ma'am, I didn't realize. We weren't aware that a senior officer was present." Sarah returned her identification to her wallet with the same deliberate movement she had used to retrieve it. "I gathered that from your conversation. In fact, your assumption that I was a civilian woman trying to meet military men was part of what made your discussion so enlightening." The comment struck Morrison like a physical blow. He realized that his dismissive attitude toward her presence, his crude speculation about her motivations, and his condescending offer to explain how the Navy really worked had all been directed at a captain whose operational experience and strategic responsibility far exceeded his own. Torres cleared his throat nervously. "Captain, if I may ask, how long were you listening to our conversation?" Sarah smiled, but the expression carried new authority now that her rank was known. "Long enough to hear your analysis of naval leadership qualifications, your critique of diversity initiatives, and your opinions about who should and shouldn't be considered for command positions." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Every officer within hearing range understood that junior personnel criticizing senior leadership in public settings represented a serious breach of military decorum, especially when those criticisms were based on incomplete information and prejudiced assumptions. Morrison's face had turned bright red, whether from embarrassment, alcohol, or the sudden realization that his career prospects might have been damaged by his loose tongue. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for any inappropriate comments. We were speaking casually and didn't intend any disrespect to senior leadership." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I understand you were speaking casually. That's actually what made your comments so valuable. Casual conversations often reveal genuine attitudes more clearly than formal discussions." She pulled out the empty chair at their table and sat down, transforming the dynamic from a standing confrontation to a seated discussion. The gesture suggested she intended to continue the conversation rather than simply deliver a reprimand and leave. "Lieutenant Morrison, you made several assertions about command qualifications that I found interesting," Sarah continued. "You argued that combat experience should be the primary factor in selecting senior officers. Would you like to know about my combat experience?" Morrison nodded reluctantly, understanding that he was about to receive an education in the very topic he had been pontificating about moments earlier. Sarah's voice took on the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering operational briefings. "I've commanded vessels in 3 combat zones over the past 8 years. During Operation Inherent Resolve, I led a destroyer group that conducted precision strikes against ISIS targets while simultaneously protecting Allied shipping lanes. We engaged enemy forces on 14 separate occasions, including 2 incidents where hostile fast boats attempted to attack commercial vessels under our protection." She paused, allowing the officers to absorb the information. Morrison had never engaged enemy forces in actual combat, despite his confident assertions about what real warfare required. "In the South China Sea, I commanded operations during the tensions with China over artificial island construction. We maintained freedom of navigation while avoiding escalation that could have led to international conflict. The operations required split-second tactical decisions combined with deep understanding of diplomatic implications." Torres shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his earlier comments about South China Sea policy had been directed at someone who actually implemented that policy in real-world conditions. Sarah continued her recitation with professional precision. "Most recently, I commanded the destroyer USS Russell during anti-piracy operations off Somalia. We interdicted 17 pirate vessels, rescued 43 hostages, and coordinated with international naval forces to establish protective corridors for commercial shipping." The litany of actual combat experience contrasted sharply with Morrison's training missions and simulation exercises. Other officers listening began to understand that they were hearing from someone whose operational resume far exceeded anything they had personally experienced. "But here's what I found most interesting about your earlier comments," Sarah said, her tone becoming more pointed. You argued that people without combat experience shouldn't be considered for senior command positions. Yet you also criticized current naval leadership for being out of touch with real warfare. Morrison frowned, not immediately understanding the contradiction she was highlighting. Sarah clarified her point. The senior officers you were criticizing tonight have collectively commanded operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and dozens of other conflict zones over the past 2 decades. Admiral Richardson led submarine operations in the Persian Gulf. Admiral Hayes commanded carrier operations during the initial phases of Operation Enduring Freedom. The desk jockeys you dismissed have more combat experience than most officers will accumulate in entire careers. The revelation struck the group like a cold wave. Their confident criticism of senior leadership had been based on the assumption that those leaders lacked real-world experience, when in fact the opposite was true. Torres attempted damage control. Captain, we obviously didn't have complete information about senior leadership backgrounds. Our comments were based on limited perspective and, probably alcohol-influenced judgment. Sarah appreciated the honesty in Torres's admission. I respect your acknowledgement, Commander Torres. Limited perspective is exactly what I wanted to address. You see, the problem isn't that junior officers have opinions about leadership that's healthy and normal. The problem is when those opinions are formed without adequate information or consideration of complexity. She gestured toward the room full of listening officers. Everyone here is intelligent, dedicated, and committed to naval service. But, intelligence becomes dangerous when it's combined with incomplete information and overconfidence. Morrison had remained silent, processing the implications of his evening's mistakes. Sarah turned her attention back to him. Lieutenant Morrison, you spoke confidently about what qualifies someone for command. Based on your own criteria, how would you evaluate my qualifications? The question forced Morrison to confront his earlier assumptions directly. Ma'am, based on what you've just described, your qualifications clearly exceed the standards I outlined. Sarah nodded. And, yet, when you first saw me tonight, what assumptions did you make about my qualifications, my background, my reasons for being here? Morrison's discomfort was visible. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than knowledge. I saw a civilian woman and concluded she was here for social reasons rather than professional ones. Exactly, Sarah said. You made the same mistake about me that you made about senior naval leadership in general. You assumed that people who didn't fit your preconceived notions couldn't possibly be qualified for positions of responsibility. Torres leaned forward slightly. Captain, are you saying that our concerns about diversity initiatives are unfounded? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. I'm saying your concerns might be based on misunderstanding what diversity initiatives actually accomplish. You seem to view inclusion efforts as compromising merit-based selection, when in fact they're designed to ensure that merit is recognized regardless of someone's demographic characteristics. She pointed toward the room of officers around them. Look at this gathering tonight. Intelligent, capable people who all took the same oath, completed the same training, and served the same mission. Yet your conversation assumed that some categories of people are inherently less qualified for leadership than others. Morrison was beginning to understand the broader implications of Sarah's lesson. You're saying we were exhibiting the same prejudices that could cause us to overlook qualified candidates? I'm saying that assumptions are dangerous in any context, but, especially in military operations where lives depend on accurate assessment of people and situations, Sarah replied. Tonight you assumed I was unqualified based on my appearance. In operational settings, such assumptions could cause you to underestimate enemies, overlook allies, or misread situations. The conversation had attracted attention from across the bar. Officers who had been engaged in their own discussions found themselves drawn into the impromptu leadership lesson unfolding at Morrison's table. The casual social atmosphere had transformed into something approaching a professional development session. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Admiral Hayes. How's your reconnaissance going? Learning anything interesting about junior officer attitudes? Sarah smiled slightly as she responded, very educational evening. We'll have comprehensive insights to share tomorrow. Torres noticed her texting and asked, "Captain, may I ask who you're communicating with?" Sarah looked up from her phone. "Admiral Hayes, Pacific Fleet Command." She suggested I spend some time in informal settings to better understand junior officer perspectives on leadership and policy. The revelation that Sarah's presence at the bar was part of a senior leadership initiative to understand junior officer attitudes added another layer of significance to the evening's events. Morrison realized that his criticism of command leadership had been delivered directly to someone conducting official assessment of those very attitudes. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, "will our conversation tonight be included in official reports?" Sarah considered the question. "That depends on what you learn from this experience and how you choose to apply those lessons going forward. This could be remembered as an evening when promising young officers demonstrated concerning attitudes, or as an evening when they showed capacity for growth and self-reflection." The implicit choice between career damage and personal development was clear. Sarah was offering them an opportunity to transform this potentially devastating encounter into a learning experience. Torres spoke first. "Captain, I want to understand better how to avoid the mistakes we made tonight. What should we have done differently?" Sarah appreciated the question's focus on improvement rather than damage control. "First, be more careful about making assumptions regarding people's qualifications or backgrounds based on limited information. Second, consider that criticism of leadership might be more effective when it's informed by complete understanding of the challenges leaders face. Third, recognize that confident opinions require factual foundation." Morrison nodded. "And, in terms of our discussion about diversity initiatives and command qualifications?" Sarah's response was measured. "Ask yourself whether your concerns about merit-based selection would be equally valid if applied to your own careers. Have you never benefited from someone giving you opportunities despite your limited experience? Has your path to advancement been based purely on demonstrated combat performance, or have people invested in your potential based on other indicators of capability?" The questions forced uncomfortable self-examination. Both Morrison and Torres had received promotions and assignments based on potential rather than proven performance, yet they had criticized similar opportunities when extended to officers from different backgrounds. "I think what you're saying is that we applied different standards to ourselves than to others," Torres said slowly. "I'm saying that fair assessment requires consistent criteria," Sarah replied. "If you believe combat experience is essential for command, then you should expect to wait until you have extensive combat experience before being considered for leadership positions. If you believe potential and demonstrated ability in training environments are valid indicators, then you should apply that standard universally." Morrison was wrestling with the implications of Sarah's logic. "But surely some standards are appropriate for command positions? We can't just ignore qualifications entirely." Sarah nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. Standards are crucial. The question is whether your standards are based on actual job requirements or on assumptions about what kinds of people are capable of meeting those requirements." She gestured toward herself. "When you saw me tonight, did you assess my qualifications for command based on relevant criteria, or did you make assumptions based on irrelevant characteristics?" Morrison's embarrassment was evident. "Irrelevant characteristics. I never considered that you might have military experience at all. And, yet, if you had seen a man sitting alone in civilian clothes, would you have made the same assumptions about his background and motivations?" The question highlighted the gender-based nature of Morrison's initial assessment. He had automatically categorized Sarah as someone seeking male attention rather than considering alternative explanations for her presence. Torres interjected. "Captain, how do we develop better judgment about these situations? How do we avoid making similar mistakes in the future?" Sarah smiled, pleased by the question's focus on practical improvement. "Start by recognizing that your initial impressions might be wrong. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Consider multiple explanations for what you observe. And remember that competence comes in many forms." The discussion was interrupted by the approach of another officer. Commander Lisa Park, a supply officer from the USS Abraham Lincoln, had been listening from a nearby table and decided to join the conversation. Captain Shen, I hope you don't mind my interrupting, Park said. I wanted to thank you for addressing these issues directly. As a female officer, I've experienced some of the attitudes these gentlemen expressed tonight. Sarah gestured for Park to join them. Please sit, Commander Park. Your perspective would be valuable for this discussion. Park took the offered chair and looked directly at Morrison and Torres. Gentlemen, I've served on 5 deployments, including 2 combat zones. I've managed logistics operations that kept battle groups supplied during extended operations. Yet I regularly encounter assumptions that I'm less qualified for leadership than male officers with less experience. Morrison and Torres exchanged uncomfortable glances. Park's credentials clearly exceeded their own, yet they realized they might have made similar assumptions about her capabilities based on gender rather than performance. Commander Park raises an important point about the difference between individual assessment and categorical assumptions, Sarah said. When you dismiss entire groups of people based on demographic characteristics, you risk overlooking exceptional individuals who could contribute significantly to mission success. Torres asked, how do we balance recognition of individual merit with concerns about maintaining military effectiveness? Sarah's response was immediate. By focusing on actual performance rather than assumptions about potential performance. Commander Park's logistics expertise directly supports combat operations. My destroyer squadron command involves coordinating complex multi-ship operations under hostile conditions. These are measurable contributions to military effectiveness. Park added, the question isn't whether women or minorities can serve effectively in leadership roles. The question is whether we're creating environments where everyone can contribute their maximum potential to mission success. Morrison had been quiet during Park's comments, but now he spoke up. I'm beginning to understand that my concerns about qualifications might have been misplaced. Instead of questioning whether certain people deserve opportunities, I should focus on developing my own capabilities. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right mindset. Competition should motivate excellence, not resentment. If you believe you're more qualified than someone else, prove it through superior performance. The conversation had drawn the attention of most officers in the bar. Many had abandoned their own tables to listen more closely to the impromptu leadership discussion. The social atmosphere had transformed into something resembling a professional development seminar. Torres looked around the room and commented, Captain, I think this conversation has been educational for more people than just our table. Sarah followed his gaze, noting the attentive faces surrounding them. Good. Leadership lessons are most effective when they're shared broadly. Everyone here will face situations where assumptions and prejudices could compromise their judgment. She stood up, preparing to conclude the evening's discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for an enlightening evening. You've given me valuable insights into junior officer perspectives that will inform senior leadership discussions about policy and training. Morrison stood as well, following proper protocol for addressing a senior officer. Captain Shen, thank you for turning what could have been a career-ending mistake into a learning opportunity. I won't forget the lessons from tonight. Torres also rose. Ma'am, I hope we can continue to learn from officers like you who are willing to engage with junior personnel directly. Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time since revealing her identity. That's exactly what good leadership looks like, people learning from each other regardless of rank or background. I hope you'll remember that as you advance in your careers. As Sarah gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Park stood and extended her hand. Captain, it's been an honor to meet you. I hope I can serve under your command someday. Sarah shook Park's hand firmly. Commander, based on what I've seen tonight, I'd be honored to have you in my squadron. Leaders who are willing to speak up in difficult situations are exactly what the Navy needs. The endorsement from a senior officer clearly meant a great deal to Park, who had probably experienced her share of career challenges related to gender bias in military settings. Sarah turned back to Morrison and Torres one final time. Gentlemen, I want you to remember something important. Tonight's lesson isn't about political correctness or social agendas. It's about operational effectiveness. Militaries that effectively utilize all available talent perform better than militaries that limit themselves based on prejudice or tradition. Morrison nodded seriously. Understood, ma'am. We'll work on developing better judgment and more inclusive attitudes. Sarah's final comment carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The enemy doesn't care about your assumptions or prejudices. They care about your capabilities and effectiveness. Make sure your biases don't become their advantages. With that, Captain Saracen walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of junior officers who would remember this evening for the rest of their careers. The casual social gathering had transformed into a masterclass in leadership, judgment, and the dangers of assumption. The morning after Sarah's encounter at the Anchor Club, word had already begun spreading through the naval community in San Diego. Military installations are notorious for rapid information flow, and the story of junior officers being educated by a disguised squadron commander was too compelling to remain secret. By 0700 hours, various versions of the incident were circulating through mess halls, ready rooms, and administrative offices across the base. Sarah arrived at Pacific Fleet headquarters 45 minutes early for her scheduled briefing with Admiral Hayes, carrying a large coffee and a tablet containing her notes from the previous evening's observations. The headquarters building buzzed with typical morning activity, officers hurrying to meetings, enlisted personnel managing administrative tasks, and civilians coordinating the complex logistics of running a major naval command. Admiral Patricia Hayes had commanded Pacific Fleet operations for 18 months, earning respect throughout the Navy for her strategic thinking and direct leadership style. At 54, she had broken several barriers during her own career advancement, making her particularly interested in Sarah's informal reconnaissance mission among junior officers. Sarah knocked on the Admiral's office door at precisely 07:15, 15 minutes before their scheduled meeting. Military punctuality was both professional courtesy and operational necessity, a lesson she had learned during her first deployment 20 years earlier. "Come in, Captain Chan," Admiral Hayes called. "I've been looking forward to hearing about your evening adventure. Coffee's fresh if you need more caffeine." Sarah entered the spacious office, noting the familiar combination of military efficiency and personal touches that characterized senior officer workspaces. Charts of Pacific Fleet operations covered one wall, while commendations and photographs from Hayes's career decorated another. "Good morning, Admiral. I brought detailed notes and some interesting observations that might affect our personnel policies," Sarah said, taking the offered seat across from Hayes's desk. Admiral Hayes leaned back in her chair, a slight smile indicating her anticipation. "I've already heard some interesting rumors about what happened at the Anchor Club last night. Something about junior officers getting educated about assumptions and command qualifications?" Sarah wasn't surprised that Hayes had heard preliminary reports. "The rumors are probably accurate, though I suspect they've been embellished through retelling. The basic facts are that I observed several junior officers expressing concerning attitudes about senior leadership and diversity initiatives." She opened her tablet and consulted her notes. Lieutenant Morrison, a fighter pilot from the Nimitz, and Lieutenant Commander Torres, a submarine officer, were leading a discussion that revealed significant misunderstanding about command selection processes and strategic decision-making. Admiral Hayes poured herself coffee while listening. "What specific misunderstandings did you observe?" Sarah organized her thoughts before responding. "They argued that combat experience should be the primary qualification for senior command, while simultaneously criticizing current leadership as inexperienced desk jockeys. They opposed diversity initiatives based on the belief that merit-based selection was being compromised for political reasons." "Classic junior officer attitudes," Hayes commented. "Did you get the impression these views were widespread among their peer group?" Sarah nodded. Their comments drew support from other officers at nearby tables. The attitude seemed to reflect broader cultural issues within junior officer populations, possibly influenced by external political rhetoric about military personnel policies. Admiral Hayes set down her coffee cup and leaned forward. "Walk me through how you handled the situation. I'm particularly interested in your decision to reveal your identity rather than simply observing." Sarah consulted her notes again. "Initially I planned to continue observing and report back without intervention. But, their comments crossed from professional criticism into personal attacks on senior officers, including speculation about how women and minorities received their positions. She paused, remembering the moment when Morrison's remarks became unacceptable. They began making assumptions about my own presence at the bar, categorizing me as a civilian woman trying to meet military men. The combination of professional disrespect and personal prejudice created a teaching opportunity one couldn't ignore. Admiral Hayes smiled. I imagine their reaction was memorable when you showed them your identification. The immediate shock was significant, Sarah confirmed. Lieutenant Morrison went completely silent for several minutes. Commander Torres began treating me with appropriate military courtesy, but both seemed genuinely surprised that their assumptions about my background were wrong. Sarah flipped through several pages of notes. What interested me most was their reasoning process. They had constructed elaborate theories about military leadership based on incomplete information, then defended those theories with confidence that exceeded their knowledge base. Admiral Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking the harbor, where several destroyers were visible at their moorings. That pattern concerns me because it suggests problems with critical thinking skills among our junior officers. If they can't accurately assess situations in social settings, how will they perform under operational pressure? The observation highlighted a connection Sarah hadn't fully considered. You're right, Admiral. The same cognitive errors that led them to misread my background could compromise their tactical judgment in combat situations. Hayes turned back toward Sarah. Tell me about their response once they understood who they were talking to. Were they defensive, or did they show capacity for learning? Sarah's expression brightened slightly. Actually, that was the most encouraging part of the evening. Once they processed their initial shock, both officers demonstrated genuine willingness to examine their assumptions and consider alternative perspectives. She found the relevant section in her notes. Lieutenant Morrison acknowledged that he had made assumptions based on appearance rather than knowledge. Commander Torres asked specific questions about how to develop better judgment in similar situations. Admiral Hayes returned to her seat. That suggests the problems are correctable through proper mentoring and education rather than being fundamental character flaws. Sarah agreed. I believe both officers are capable of growth if given appropriate guidance. They're intelligent and dedicated, but they've been operating with incomplete information and possibly negative influences from external sources. Admiral Hayes picked up a pen and began making notes on her own tablet. What recommendations do you have for addressing these attitudes more broadly? We can't send senior officers undercover to every bar in San Diego. Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared several suggestions. First, we need better communication between senior and junior officers about the reasoning behind personnel policies. Many junior officers don't understand the strategic thinking that informs diversity initiatives. She consulted her notes before continuing. Second, we should consider more informal mentoring opportunities where junior officers can interact with senior leadership outside formal command structures. Last night's conversation would never have happened in an official setting. Admiral Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Those are good starts. What else? Sarah's third recommendation was more complex. We need to address the external influences that are shaping junior officer attitudes. Political rhetoric about military personnel policies is creating confusion about the Navy's actual standards and procedures. Admiral Hayes stopped writing and looked up. That's a delicate area. We can't control external political messaging, but we can ensure our internal communications are clear and consistent. Sarah agreed. Exactly. We need proactive education about why our policies exist and how they contribute to operational effectiveness. Many junior officers view diversity initiatives as political compromises rather than strategic advantages. Admiral Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing Sarah's recommendations. How do you think senior officers should respond when they encounter the attitudes you observed last night? Sarah had considered this question extensively during her drive to headquarters. Direct engagement, like what happened last night, can be very effective if handled properly. But it requires senior officers who are willing to listen first and educate second.
she elaborated on her approach. I spent considerable time listening to their arguments before revealing my identity.
That allowed me to understand their reasoning process and address specific misconceptions rather than delivering generic lectures about proper attitudes.
Admiral Hayes smiled.
You turned a potentially disciplinary situation into a learning opportunity. Not every senior officer has the patience or skill to manage that kind of intervention.
Sarah acknowledged the compliment.
I was fortunate that Morrison and Torres were genuinely interested in learning once they understood their mistakes.
The outcome could have been different with officers who were more defensive or resistant to feedback. Admiral Hayes consulted her own notes. I want to discuss one more aspect of last night's incident.
Commander Park joined your conversation and shared her own experiences with gender bias.
How significant do you think those issues are within our junior officer population? Sarah's expression became more serious.
Based on Park's comments and my own observations, gender bias remains a significant issue.
But I think it's often unconscious rather than deliberately discriminatory.
She found relevant notes from Park's contributions to the discussion. Commander Park has clearly faced challenges related to assumptions about her capabilities, despite having more deployment experience than many of her male peers. But she's also found ways to excel despite those challenges.
Admiral Hayes made additional notes. Do you think the bias issues are getting better or worse over time? Sarah considered the question carefully. Mixed signals.
Formal policies have improved significantly, and most overt discrimination has been eliminated. But unconscious bias persists, especially in social settings where people feel free to express unfiltered opinions.
Admiral Hayes nodded.
That aligns with other reports I've received. Progress in official policies, but continued challenges in cultural attitudes.
Sarah's final observation was particularly important.
I think many male officers genuinely want to be supportive, but they lack understanding about how their assumptions and comments affect their female colleagues. Last night's discussion helped Morrison and Torres recognize behaviors they hadn't previously considered problematic. Admiral Hayes finished her notes and set down her pen.
Captain Chen, your reconnaissance mission exceeded my expectations.
You've provided valuable intelligence about junior officer attitudes and demonstrated effective intervention techniques. Sarah felt satisfied with the briefing's progression.
Thank you, Admiral.
The experience reinforced my belief that most problems with military culture can be addressed through education and mentoring rather than punitive measures.
Admiral Hayes stood, indicating the meeting was approaching conclusion. I want to implement some of your recommendations immediately. Can you develop a proposal for increased informal mentoring opportunities between senior and junior officers? Sarah nodded. I'll have a preliminary proposal on your desk by end of week.
I think we can create structured opportunities for the kind of honest communication that happened last night.
Admiral Hayes walked toward the office door with Sarah.
I also want you to consider speaking at our next junior officer professional development seminar. Your insights about assumptions and leadership judgment would benefit a broader audience.
The suggestion appealed to Sarah.
I'd be happy to participate.
Last night convinced me that many junior officers are hungry for honest feedback and guidance from senior leadership.
Admiral Hayes opened the door and paused.
One final question, Captain. How do you think Morrison and Torres will handle this experience going forward? Will it positively influence their leadership development? Sarah considered the question as they stepped into the hallway.
I believe it will, assuming they receive appropriate follow-up mentoring. They demonstrated genuine remorse about their mistakes and sincere interest in improvement.
Admiral Hayes extended her hand for a farewell handshake. Excellent work, Captain.
Your willingness to engage directly with junior officers reflects the kind of leadership our Navy needs at all levels.
As Sarah left Pacific Fleet Headquarters, she reflected on the morning's discussion and its implications for her own leadership responsibilities.
The previous evening's encounter had been unplanned, but it highlighted the importance of senior officers remaining connected to the attitudes and concerns of junior personnel. Her next stop was the destroyer squadron headquarters, where she had scheduled meetings with her own department heads to discuss upcoming training exercises. The routine of command responsibilities provided comfortable contrast to the previous evening's dramatic revelations and morning's policy discussions. Commander James Wright, her executive officer, greeted Sarah as she entered the squadron offices. Wright had served with Sarah for 8 months and had developed deep respect for her leadership style and operational expertise.
"Good morning, Captain. I understand you had an interesting evening last night," Wright said with barely concealed amusement. Sarah wasn't surprised that Wright had heard about the Anchor Club incident. News travels fast in the Navy, XO.
"I hope the story hasn't been too distorted through retelling."
Wright grinned.
The basic facts seem consistent across multiple sources. Junior officers making assumptions about a civilian woman who turned out to be their squadron commander.
I wish I could have witnessed their reaction.
Sarah hung her cover on the office coat rack and settled behind her desk.
It was educational for everyone involved, including me.
Sometimes we need reminders about the power of assumptions and the importance of maintaining connections with junior personnel.
Wright's expression became more serious.
"Captain, I've been thinking about some issues we've discussed regarding unit cohesion and communication.
Last night's incident might provide useful lessons for our own squadron." Sarah looked up from her computer screen. "What kind of lessons are you thinking about, XO?" Wright consulted his tablet before responding. "We've had some informal complaints about communication gaps between senior and junior officers within the squadron."
"Nothing serious, but junior officers sometimes feel disconnected from decision-making processes."
The comment resonated with Sarah's observations from the previous evening.
"That aligns with what I learned last night. Junior officers often develop theories about senior leadership motivations based on limited information."
Wright nodded. "Exactly. I'm wondering if we could implement some of the informal mentoring approaches you discussed with Admiral Hayes this morning." Sarah was impressed by Wright's quick connection between her reconnaissance observations and their own unit management challenges. "What specific approaches do you think might work within our squadron?" Wright had clearly given the matter considerable thought. "Monthly informal discussions between department heads and junior officers, outside the formal chain of command structure. Opportunities for honest feedback about policies and procedures without fear of retribution." Sarah liked the suggestion. "That could address some of the communication gaps you mentioned. Junior officers need opportunities to ask questions and express concerns without going through formal grievance procedures." Wright added another idea. "We could also rotate junior officers through different department head briefings, giving them broader understanding of squadron operations and decision-making processes." The proposal addressed one of Sarah's concerns from the previous evening: junior officers making policy criticisms based on incomplete understanding of operational complexity. "Excellent idea, XO. Exposure to strategic planning discussions would help junior officers understand the reasoning behind decisions that affect them." Wright made notes on his tablet. "I'll develop a preliminary proposal for implementing these programs within our squadron. We could potentially serve as a pilot program for fleet-wide implementation." Sarah appreciated Wright's initiative. "Do that, XO. And coordinate with Admiral Hayes' staff to ensure our efforts align with broader Pacific Fleet initiatives in this area." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Yeoman Second Class Rodriguez entered with a message for Sarah. "Captain, you have a phone call from Lieutenant Morrison aboard the USS Nimitz. He asked if he could speak with you briefly about last night's discussion." Sarah exchanged glances with Wright before responding. "Put the call through to my office, Rodriguez." Wright started to leave to give Sarah privacy, but she gestured for him to remain. "Stay, XO. This might be relevant to our discussion about junior officer mentoring." Sarah picked up the phone on the second ring. "Captain Chen speaking." Morrison's voice carried nervous formality. "Good morning, Captain. I hope I'm not interrupting important duties. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night." Sarah's tone was professional but encouraging. "Good morning, Lieutenant Morrison. I have a few minutes to talk. How can I help you? Morrison's voice revealed genuine concern. Ma'am, I've been thinking about our discussion all night.
I realized that my comments reflected poorly on my judgment and professionalism. I wanted to ask for guidance about how to improve my understanding of leadership and command responsibilities.
Sarah was pleased by Morrison's proactive approach. I appreciate your call, Lieutenant. What specific areas would you like guidance on?
Morrison had clearly prepared for the conversation. First, I'd like to understand better how senior officers make strategic decisions. My criticism last night was based on incomplete information, and I want to avoid similar mistakes in the future.
Sarah smiled at Morrison's direct acknowledgement of his errors. That's an excellent place to start. Strategic decision-making involves far more complexity than most junior officers realize. Are you interested in educational opportunities to learn more about those processes? Morrison's enthusiasm was evident. Absolutely, ma'am.
I want to become a better officer, and last night showed me how much I still need to learn. Sarah looked at Wright, who nodded encouragingly.
Lieutenant Morrison, my executive officer, and I were just discussing mentoring programs for junior officers. Would you be interested in participating in informal educational sessions about command decision-making? Morrison's response was immediate. Yes, ma'am.
I think that would be incredibly valuable, not just for me but for other junior officers who might have similar gaps in understanding. Sarah made notes while continuing the conversation.
I'll have my staff contact you about scheduling.
We're developing programs to provide junior officers with broader exposure to strategic planning and policy development.
Morrison's gratitude was apparent. Thank you, Captain. I also wanted to ask about Commander Torres.
He's been equally concerned about our conversation last night and would appreciate similar guidance opportunities.
Sarah appreciated Morrison's concern for his colleague.
Include Commander Torres in any programs we develop. Officers who are willing to acknowledge mistakes and seek improvement are exactly the people we want to invest in.
Morrison's final comment revealed important insight.
Captain, last night made me realize that I've been making assumptions not just about senior officers, but about many aspects of military service.
I want to develop better critical thinking skills. Sarah's response carried the warmth of a mentor addressing a promising student.
Self-awareness is the foundation of leadership development, Lieutenant Morrison.
The fact that you recognize these issues and want to address them indicates strong potential for growth.
After concluding the call, Sarah turned to Wright with renewed enthusiasm for their mentoring program discussions. XO, Morrison's call reinforces everything we discussed about junior officer development needs. He's genuinely motivated to learn and improve.
Wright nodded. His willingness to reach out directly shows character. Most officers would try to forget about last night's embarrassment rather than seeking additional feedback. Sarah began outlining specific program elements on her tablet. Let's accelerate development of our mentoring initiatives.
We have motivated participants and clear educational objectives.
Wright consulted his own notes.
I'll coordinate with department heads to identify senior officers who would be effective mentors.
We need people who can balance honest feedback with supportive guidance. Sarah agreed.
And let's ensure our programs address the specific issues from last night: assumptions about qualifications, understanding of strategic decision-making, and appreciation for diversity as operational advantage.
Wright made additional notes.
Captain, I think last night's incident could become a positive turning point for junior officer development throughout the fleet if we handle the follow-up properly. Sarah looked out her office window toward the ships of her squadron, thinking about the hundreds of junior officers serving aboard those vessels. XO, good leadership sometimes emerges from unexpected situations.
Last night reminded me that our most important responsibility might be developing the next generation of naval leaders.
Wright gathered his materials to leave. I'll have preliminary program proposals ready for your review by tomorrow morning, Captain. As Wright departed, Sarah reflected on how a casual evening at a local bar had evolved into a comprehensive initiative for improving leadership development throughout the Pacific Fleet. Sometimes the most significant changes began with simple conversations between people willing to listen, learn, and grow. 3 months after the incident at the Anchor Club, the ripple effects of Sarah's encounter with Morrison and Torres had grown into a comprehensive Pacific Fleet initiative for improving junior officer development. What began as an impromptu teaching moment had evolved into structured mentoring programs, enhanced communication protocols, and a renewed focus on bridging the gap between senior leadership and junior personnel. Sarah stood in Conference Room Delta at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, preparing for the first formal review of the Junior Officer Leadership Development Initiative. Admiral Hayes had scheduled the meeting to assess progress and determine whether the program should be expanded fleet-wide. Representatives from 6 different commands were present, including several junior officers who had participated in the pilot programs.
Lieutenant Morrison entered the conference room wearing his dress blue uniform, the gold wings on his chest reflecting the overhead lighting. His confident stride and professional bearing contrasted sharply with the defensive young man Sarah had encountered 3 months earlier. Behind him walked Commander Torres, equally transformed in his presentation and demeanor.
"Good morning, Captain Chen," Morrison said, extending his hand for a professional handshake.
"Thank you for including us in this review session. The mentoring program has been transformative for my understanding of naval leadership."
Sarah shook Morrison's hand, noting the genuine maturity in his expression.
"Good morning, Lieutenant Morrison.
I'm looking forward to hearing your assessment of the program's effectiveness."
Torres stepped forward as well. "Captain, I want to echo Jake's sentiments. The strategic planning exposure we've received has completely changed my perspective on command decision-making."
Sarah smiled, pleased by the evident growth in both officers. "Commander Torres, your willingness to engage with these development opportunities has been impressive.
I understand you've become a mentor yourself for more junior officers." Torres nodded. "Yes, ma'am.
Working with ensigns and junior lieutenants has helped me understand how important it is to share knowledge and experience across all levels of the organization."
Admiral Hayes entered the conference room, followed by Captain Maria Santos from Destroyer Squadron 12 and Commander David Kim from Submarine Squadron 7.
The assembled group represented a cross-section of Pacific Fleet leadership committed to improving junior officer development. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin our assessment of the JOLDI program," Admiral Hayes announced, taking her seat at the head of the conference table.
"Captain Chen, please provide an overview of the initiative's development and current status." Sarah activated the presentation screen and began her briefing.
The Junior Officer Leadership Development Initiative grew from observations about communication gaps between senior and junior officers, specifically regarding policy understanding and strategic awareness. She clicked to the first slide, showing participation statistics from the pilot program. "Over the past 3 months, we've implemented structured mentoring relationships between senior and junior officers across 6 commands, involving 237 participants."
Captain Santos leaned forward to examine the data. "Those participation numbers exceed our initial projections. What's driving the high level of engagement?" Sarah clicked to the next slide, displaying feedback survey results.
Post-program surveys indicate that junior officers appreciate opportunities for honest dialogue with senior leadership outside formal command structures. They're hungry for understanding about decision-making processes and strategic planning.
Morrison raised his hand to request permission to speak. "Admiral Hayes, if I may add from the participant perspective?" Admiral Hayes nodded.
"Please share your observations, Lieutenant Morrison."
Morrison stood, following formal military protocol.
"Ma'am, before participating in this program, I had significant misconceptions about senior leadership motivations and capabilities. The mentoring sessions provided context for policies and decisions that I had previously criticized without understanding."
He paused, organizing his thoughts. "Most importantly, I learned that effective criticism requires comprehensive understanding of the issues being addressed.
My previous complaints about leadership were based on incomplete information and prejudiced assumptions."
Admiral Hayes appreciated Morrison's candor. "Lieutenant Morrison, can you provide specific examples of how your perspective changed?" Morrison consulted his notes before responding. "Yes, ma'am.
I had criticized diversity initiatives as compromising merit-based selection. Through program discussions, I learned that these policies actually enhance operational effectiveness by ensuring we utilize all available talent.
Sarah was pleased by Morrison's articulation of lessons learned.
His growth from the confrontational young pilot she had encountered at the Anchor Club was remarkable.
Torres requested permission to speak as well. Admiral, I'd like to address the strategic planning component of the program. Admiral Hayes gestured for Torres to continue. Torres stood and addressed the group. The exposure to strategic planning sessions revealed the complexity of operational decision-making that junior officers typically don't see.
Understanding the multiple factors that inform senior leadership decisions, logistics, diplomacy, intelligence, resource allocation, has made me more effective in my own role.
Commander Kim interjected. Commander Torres, how has this understanding affected your day-to-day performance? Torres considered the question carefully.
Sir, I now approach tactical decisions with better appreciation for their strategic implications. I ask different questions during briefings, and I provide more comprehensive input when senior officers request my assessment of situations.
Sarah clicked to the next presentation slide, showing performance metrics for program participants. Objective measures support the subjective feedback we're hearing.
Participants show improved performance ratings, enhanced leadership potential assessments, and increased retention rates.
Captain Santos examined the performance data. These improvements are significant. Captain Chen, what specific program elements do you believe are most effective?
Sarah had anticipated the question and prepared a detailed response. 3 components appear most valuable.
First, regular informal discussions between senior and junior officers about strategic decision-making. Second, rotation of junior officers through different department head briefings to broaden their understanding. Third, mentoring relationships that provide honest feedback about leadership development. Admiral Hayes made notes while Sarah explained the program elements. What challenges have you encountered during implementation? Sarah clicked to a slide displaying program challenges and solutions. Initial resistance from some senior officers who viewed mentoring as additional administrative burden.
We addressed this by demonstrating that effective mentoring actually improves unit performance and reduces disciplinary issues.
Commander Kim asked, what about resistance from junior officers? Sarah's response revealed insight gained from 3 months of program administration.
Minimal resistance from junior officers, but significant enthusiasm gaps based on previous experiences with senior leadership. Officers who had negative encounters with authoritarian commanders were initially skeptical about honest dialogue opportunities.
Torres requested permission to address the resistance issue. Admiral Hayes, if I may speak to the junior officer perspective on this challenge? Admiral Hayes nodded encouragingly. Torres remained standing as he responded. Many junior officers have experienced senior leaders who were unapproachable or dismissive of subordinate input. The Jolie program required us to trust that senior officers genuinely wanted honest feedback rather than simply compliance. Morrison added his perspective. The authenticity of the mentoring relationships was crucial. Junior officers can immediately detect whether senior officers are genuinely interested in dialogue or just going through administrative motions. Sarah appreciated both officers' insights about program authenticity. Their observations highlight the importance of senior officer selection for mentoring roles. Not every experienced leader is suited for effective mentoring relationships. Admiral Hayes looked up from her notes. Captain Chen, what criteria do you use for selecting senior officer mentors? Sarah clicked to the relevant presentation slide. We look for officers who demonstrate curiosity about subordinate perspectives, willingness to acknowledge their own learning experiences, and communication skills that encourage honest dialogue rather than defensive responses. Captain Santos raised an important implementation question. How do you balance honest feedback with maintaining military discipline and command authority? Sarah had wrestled with this challenge throughout program development. The key is establishing clear boundaries between mentoring discussions and operational command relationships. Mentoring sessions focus on professional development and understanding, not grievance procedures or policy disputes. Commander Kim elaborated on Santos's question. Do junior officers ever cross appropriate lines during mentoring sessions? Torres answered before Sarah could respond.
Sir, the program guidelines are very clear about appropriate discussion topics. We focus on understanding decision-making processes, developing leadership skills, and learning about strategic thinking rather than complaining about specific policies or commanders. Morrison added, the mentoring relationships actually increase respect for command authority because they help us understand the complexity and responsibility that senior officers handle.
Admiral Hayes smiled at the junior officers' responses. It sounds like the program is achieving its intended outcomes. Captain Chen, what recommendations do you have for fleet-wide implementation?
Sarah clicked to her final presentation slide, displaying expansion recommendations. We recommend phased implementation across Pacific Fleet commands, beginning with units that have demonstrated strong leadership cultures and expanding based on lessons learned. She elaborated on the expansion strategy. Each implementation phase should include senior officer training for effective mentoring, clear program guidelines, and regular assessment of outcomes to ensure quality control.
Captain Santos asked about resource requirements. What additional personnel or funding would fleet-wide expansion require?
Sarah consulted her implementation analysis.
Minimal additional resources, since the program utilizes existing personnel in mentoring roles.
Primary costs involve initial training for senior officers and program administration.
Admiral Hayes reviewed her notes before addressing the group. Based on this assessment, I'm prepared to recommend JOLDI expansion to Fleet Admiral Richardson. The program demonstrates clear benefits for junior officer development and unit effectiveness.
She looked directly at Morrison and Torres. Gentlemen, your participation and feedback have been invaluable for program development.
I understand you're both interested in becoming mentors yourselves? Morrison nodded enthusiastically. Yes, ma'am.
We'd like to work with even more junior officers who might benefit from the kind of guidance we've received.
Torres agreed.
Admiral, helping other officers avoid the mistakes we made and develop better understanding of leadership responsibilities would be very rewarding.
Sarah was pleased by both officers' commitment to continuing the mentoring cycle. Their enthusiasm for becoming mentors themselves demonstrates the program's sustainability.
When participants become advocates and contributors, the initiative becomes self-reinforcing. Admiral Hayes began gathering her materials. Captain Chen, please prepare a comprehensive implementation proposal for fleet-wide expansion. Include timeline, resource requirements, and quality control measures.
Sarah nodded.
I'll have the proposal ready for your review by end of week, Admiral.
Admiral Hayes stood, indicating the meeting's conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your contributions to this important initiative.
Effective leadership development is crucial for maintaining our Navy's operational excellence.
As the group began filing out of the conference room, Morrison approached Sarah privately. Captain Chen, I wanted to thank you again for turning what could have been a career-ending mistake into a growth opportunity. Sarah shook Morrison's hand warmly.
Lieutenant Morrison, your willingness to learn and grow has been impressive.
You've become an excellent example of how officers can transform challenges into development opportunities. Torres joined their conversation.
Captain, I hope we can continue working together on leadership development initiatives.
This program has become a genuine passion for both of us. Sarah smiled at both young officers.
I'm confident you'll both continue making significant contributions to naval leadership development, whether through formal programs or informal mentoring relationships.
As Morrison and Torres departed, Admiral Hayes approached Sarah.
Captain, that encounter at the Anchor Club 3 months ago has generated remarkable outcomes. Sometimes the most significant changes emerge from unexpected moments. Sarah gathered her presentation materials while responding. Admiral, it reminded me that leadership development happens everywhere, not just in classrooms or formal training programs. Sometimes a casual conversation can be more transformative than months of structured education.
Admiral Hayes headed toward the conference room exit.
Your insight about the power of authentic dialogue between senior and junior officers has influenced our approach throughout Pacific Fleet.
This program will become a model for the entire Navy. As Sarah left the conference room, she reflected on the journey from that evening at the Anchor Club to this formal program review.
What began as an uncomfortable encounter between prejudiced junior officers and a disguised senior commander had evolved into a comprehensive initiative for improving naval leadership development. The transformation of Morrison and Torres from defensive critics to enthusiastic mentors demonstrated the potential for growth when people are given opportunities to learn from their mistakes. Their willingness to acknowledge errors, seek guidance, and eventually become teachers themselves embodied the best traditions of military service.
Sarah's experience reinforced her belief that effective leadership required constant attention to the development of future leaders.
The Navy's strength depended not just on current operational capabilities, but on the wisdom, judgment, and character of officers who would command ships, squadrons, and fleets in coming decades. The success of the JOLDI program proved that bridging communication gaps between senior and junior officers could enhance both individual development and organizational effectiveness. When people understood the reasoning behind decisions and policies, they became more committed to mission success and more capable of making good decisions themselves. As Sarah walked through the corridors of Pacific Fleet headquarters toward her next meeting, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that a chance encounter had grown into something that would positively influence countless naval careers. Sometimes the most important leadership moments happen not in battle or during crisis, but in quiet conversations where people chose to listen, learn, and grow together. 2 years after the incident that sparked the Junior Officer Leadership Development Initiative, Sarah stood on the bridge of the USS Zumwalt, watching her former men's Morrison and Torres coordinate a complex multi-ship training exercise. The transformation from that contentious evening at the Anchor Club to this moment of professional excellence represented one of the most satisfying leadership achievements of her career. Morrison, now a lieutenant commander, served as the exercise coordinator, his voice calm and authoritative as he managed communications between 6 destroyers, 2 submarines, and a carrier group. His tactical decisions reflected the strategic thinking and inclusive leadership principles he had learned through the mentoring program.
"All units, this is exercise control," Morrison announced over the tactical radio network.
"Initiate Phase 3 operations.
Submarine units, begin your approach to the northern corridor while maintaining coordination with surface vessels."
Torres, recently promoted to commander and serving as Morrison's deputy, monitored multiple data streams while providing tactical advice. His expertise in submarine operations combined with his improved understanding of integrated naval warfare made him invaluable for complex training scenarios.
Sarah observed their professional interaction with quiet pride.
The 2 officers who had once dismissed senior leadership as inexperienced and out of touch now demonstrated the kind of mature judgment and collaborative leadership that the Navy desperately needed.
Admiral Hayes joined Sarah